Government has appointed a national minimum wage commission. Now, Minister of Labour, Utoni Nuyoma, said it is regrettable that a significant number of employers, both for established and emerging businesses, still follow the legacy of the contract labour system. He says that such businesses must change their ways or close down operations. The minister stressed that Namibian workers, like anywhere else in the world, aspire to achieve a decent standard of living. And with an analysis on this, I am now joined by a labour expert, that's Herbert Jauch, via Skype. Good morning to you, Mr. Jauch, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, thank you.
Firstly, what do you make of the overall working conditions of many Namibians, especially the low-income earners in the country?
In this respect, I can only agree with the Minister, because when you look in more detail at wages in Namibia, over 80% or so of employed people earn below 5,000 Namibia dollars a month. In fact, many earn just about 1,000 or 2,000 a month. And given the costs of living, that's simply not good enough. It's absolutely impossible for people to meet even just their basic needs with such low wages. And since there are so widespread, it's high time to take a decisive step towards changing that. And I think it's in this context that the Minister made the statement that far too many Namibians are earning just too little to make ends meet and to just afford the basic essentials.
Yeah. Looking at, of course, the establishment of this minimum wage commission, firstly, what do you make of the establishment of such a commission here?
Well, it's provided in the Labour Act that the Minister made and the Wage Commission. We've seen one before for domestic work that made a proposal for minimum wage for that group of workers, which was then pronounced and implemented through an Act of Parliament and adjusted. So it's now a chance to set a national minimum wage, but it must, of course, be at a level that it really makes a difference in people's lives, and that it's not kind of cementing low wages in the country. Since independence, and of course long before, we've had an economy that was essentially built on very low wages.
Yeah. And the question now, of course, would be, what would be the benefits of establishing, a national minimum wage, not only for the workers, but for the broader Namibian economy?
Yes, and these two are closely linked. A national minimum wage, if it is set at a level that's close to a living wage, where people and where workers are able to meet their basic needs, it would, number one, have a huge impact on poverty reduction in Namibia, because most households have one main income earners, and that income earner salary basically determines how people are living in the household and what they can afford. So if that happens, you have an immediate impact on poverty levels in Namibia. Secondly, you increase money that's circulating in the economy. It's a kind of demand from below that is, in a way, then also an economic stimulus package. Because as households have more money available, they'll spend it on more consumer goods, which in turn creates the necessary demand in an economy. So it has a twofold impact. It reduces poverty at household level, and it is a stimulus for the local economy, particularly basic consumer goods. And if we shift also towards a deliberate policy of producing more goods inside the country, then you have a triple spin-off from a minimum wage, if it is set as a reasonably high level.
Yeah. Mr. Jauch, in your experience, as a labour expert, what is the feasibility of establishing a national minimum wage in Namibia?
It's of course possible. The danger is, and that we've seen already in the case of domestic workers, that the Commission might be forced once again to weigh up the argument of a decent standard of living and better livelihoods in Namibia versus what they would see as market-related wages. And we've seen in the case of domestic work how that led to a very low minimum wage that's currently only at about 1,500 Namibia dollars a month. If a national minimum wage would be anywhere as low as that, it would have very little effect for many workers. In fact, it would cement the kind of low wage economy that we already have. And then those employers that pay more, let's say someone is paying $4,000 or $5,000 and the minimum wage is set at only $2,000 or even less, then the employer paying $5,000 would say, well, I'm already paying 2.5 times the minimum wage.
Exactly.
I don't need to pay anything more. Yeah. And they might dig in and feel actually encouraged to maintain low wage levels. Yeah. That is the danger, and that's the situation that we face in. Also, we have, of course, mass unemployment where a large part of workers, and I think we can safely assume now it's 40 to 50% are actually out of work. And that's a massive reserve army of labor that's available to work basically out of desperation for any type of wage that's on offer. And I think that's the dilemma, the context in which we must see the establishment of a national minimum wage, that because of high unemployment, that because of certain employers saying we can't afford anything more, there's an enormous downward pressure on wages. And the Minimum Wage Commission has to maneuver within that field and come up with a reasonably high minimum wage that will actually make a difference in workers' lives and increase wages instead of placing more downward pressure on wage levels in the country. That is the difficult circumstances that the Commission has to confront, and within that framework to find a way for a reasonably high minimum wage that will lead to an improvement.
Yeah. The Commission has up until the end of August to, of course, come back to the Minister and, of course, with their presentation on their findings, pardon me. Do you feel that this is sufficient time between now and August to establish, such a daunting task, so to say?
It is, and I don't know how much time they have in terms of leaving their normal jobs and working on the Commission, but they will certainly have to look at the statistical information that's already available through the labor force surveys that were conducted over the years. Yeah. That won't take too long and will give them a good starting point. Then they will have to consult with workers, with employers and others across the country, which can also be arranged through formal structures fairly speedily if Commission members can travel and meet people or arrange virtual meetings. Yeah. In terms of the time frame, about half a year from now, that is doable, but will require work and then a very thorough analysis looking at the various scenarios. So I guess the Commission will also need backup staff that can help them do their work and sketch various scenarios at various levels, and then based on that, come up with a recommendation to the Minister.
Yeah. Coming back to the dilemmas that you alluded to earlier with regards to the domestic minimum wage issue, also looking at for instance those employers who are already paying a certain amount. One then asks the question: wouldn't it be wiser, instead of establishing a national minimum wage, wouldn't it be wiser to establish sectoral minimum wages, so to say?
That has happened in industries where workers were at least unionized to a certain extent. So we have a sectoral minimum wage in the construction industry. CIF, the Construction Industries Federation with the union MANWU. We have a minimum wage for domestic workers, which was through the Wage Commission. We have one for security guards, yes, and we have one for farm workers. Now, the pace at which that takes place is rather slow, and you will take very, very long to reach everybody. In some industries, it's just determined basically through the collective bargaining arrangements of the trade unions. But at many companies, there are no unions, there is no collective bargaining taking place, and therefore there's absolutely no minimum wage applicable. And employers then decide unilaterally what they consider should be the entry-level wages. Yes. So the national minimum wage is an attempt to lift everyone at least to a certain level. And so in principle, it is an attempt worth following. But the danger is if you now say the minimum wage will be measured at the lowest denominator. So we'll look at the lowest paid wage sectors and we will now determine a wage amongst those. And you do not consider the better paying jobs and you do not consider costs of living in terms of what does it cost for a worker's family to meet basic needs. Then you tend to put the minimum wage at very low levels and say that's the only rate that is still competitive. If you do that, you entrench, as I said before, you entrench the low-wage economy further, and then the point is actually defeated. So a national minimum wage must be reasonably high so that it has the effect of lifting a large number of workers out of poverty and at the same time of not creating a downward pressure on better wages that we have in the country.
Yes.
And that's a tricky tightrope to walk for the Commission, and we'll see how they manage it and what amount they'll come up with at the end.
Very tricky indeed. Mr. Jauch, always a pleasure engaging you and just tapping into your mind about all things labor-related. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much.
There you have it, Labour expert Herbert Jauch talking to us this morning about the establishment of a minimum wage commission, of course, as announced by Labour Minister Utoni Nuyoma. The commission will be looking into establishing a national minimum wage across all sectors. But as you heard there, of course, this may prove to be trickier than it looks on the surface, with Herbert Jauch saying that, of course, the ideal plan would be to establish a relatively high national minimum wage to ensure that you do not infringe on those who have already been receiving a somewhat decent salary. Do stay with us.